Filipe.
Posso? Ok. Boa tarde. Portanto, eu passo a apresentação do nosso primeiro orador, Shaun Pickering. Portanto, em inglês, nasceu no país de Gales. Foi lançador olímpico pela Grã-Bretanha no lançamento do peso e medalha de bronze nos Jogos da Commonwealth. Atualmente é membro da Coaching Academy da IAF. Foi responsável pela formação de treinadores da Grã-Bretanha nos lançamentos pesados entre 2010 e 2013 e é atualmente consultor de vários atletas e federações. Now I will speak to Shaun. We present you, and first of all, it was a pleasure to have you with us in this seminar. This is our first seminar on its kind, and it will be an honor to have you here to share your experience with us. Before that, we talked about a coach who died recently. So after this brief presentation, I pass you the word in order for you to present your communication. Thank you very much to be here in advance.
No problem. Thank you for inviting me. You need to allow me to share my screen. I think at the moment my screen sharing is disabled, so the host has to allow me to share the screen so that I can put my presentation.
O ecrã. Luís Silva.
At the moment the host is still disabled.
Exactly. He's trying to put it
right
now.
It's always risky with Zoom meetings. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to try and see what my technology is working at the moment. I'm never quite sure with
I
Zoom.
don't see it yet.
No?
Not
No.
yet.
Oh, my screen sharing is paused. Why is that? Okay. Why does it say it's paused? Stop share. Let me try something else. Try this.
Yep.
Screen sharing.
Yeah, it's done.
That's okay now.
Yeah.
If I go to presentation mode, will that do it? Hold on 1 second. So for some reason, it's opening up on another screen. Let me see if, can you see my full screen or can you see one of my screens sharing with you?
No, it is not. It isn't in the presentation mode yet.
Ah, okay. Because I've got two screens here and it's coming up on my second screen in presentation mode. So I apologize for that. Let me try and see if I can share it again. And try to share this one.
That's okay now.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, done.
Okay, so let's see if it plays. So first of all, let me just start by saying that I'm not a biomechanist. You have a very good biomechanist in Paulo Oliveira in Portugal. I speak with him a lot and I enjoy my conversations. I am a coach. I work in the throws area mainly. And so it's a little bit difficult to go through a big subject in 40 minutes. So, but what I'm going to try and do is give you a little bit of a background on biomechanics and biomechanics relative to the throws. So first of all, I'm just going to say that a lot of people look at who the current champion is and try to copy them without necessarily understanding the technique and what goes into making that technique work for that athlete. So every athlete has strengths and weaknesses, And the best way to make good choices is to understand the reasons behind this. So I hope that you can see the video. I'm not sure how well it's going to come out. It's always a problem over Zoom. But this was a great competition last year in Doha in the men's shot put, where actually 4 millimeters, not 1 centimeter, but 4 millimeters separated these three athletes. And they're very different in their build. Ryan Krauser is 2 meters and 2, and Joe Kovacs is about 1.78 meters. So they're very different athletes, but all found a technique to work with. That's one of the things. One of the important parts, we're just trying to talk about what is important in biomechanics, and there's certain principles and certain things that we need to be concerned about. But the most important thing is just about how the body works. So we know, for example, that the center of gravity, the center of mass in the body is very important. So you can see when somebody moves, when an athlete is moving, their center of mass, their core is moving as they move their body. And so that's one of the things that's important for us. The human body is complex, and we're always changing shape when we are exercising and doing these throws. And so therefore you understand that the center of gravity is moving, and that will has an impact on what you're doing. So the other point that's important with that, the center of gravity also has an important point on the axis of rotation. A lot of our throwing events are rotating around. We're turning on the middle of the circle. So you can see that in the case of the top thrower on the left, she is turning right over the top of her foot. Her center of mass is very much on top, so it makes it very easy to rotate around that axis. Whereas the other athlete, you can see she stepped outside of her center of mass, and so that makes very difficult. And just as an example, this is Valerie Ullman. She threw 70 meters this year. This is a 70-meter throw in the discus. This girl is a dancer, literally. She grew up as a dancer. And you can see those characteristics and her balance and her turn on that. So 70 meters for a girl that's not so big and not so strong, just using the technique very, very well and using her balance and her strengths, which is really her rhythm. Very strong in the technique, and that's what's worked well. So forces are important things. We can't always see forces. It's simply a pull or a push, but we're aware of it because of the effect that it produces. Biomechanics is about understanding the internal, external forces acting on the body and the effects that these have on the body. Internal forces are created by muscles. So you're going to pull on your muscle and it will form a lever or something. And external forces are those acting outside the body, such as gravity or friction. One of the things I just like to do here, I've given an example, when understanding or trying to get your athletes to understand forces and forces involved, sometimes they go very, very heavy. This is a heptathlete.
Good.
She's 62 kilos in body weight, and here she's throwing a 25 kilo power bag.
Good.
Breaking up a little bit. Sorry about that. So to put an extra load rather than just a 4 kilo shot,
good,
but a 25 kilo power bag will cause her to understand a little bit more about what we're trying to understand with the forces involved. We also have linear and rotational motion. Linear motion is the movement along a straight line, and rotational is when we're turning in the circle. So in athletics, usually it's a combination of these things. In 100 meters, it's very much running in a straight line. But in our throwing events, we're using rotational motion to build up speed before releasing the discus, but yet the athlete also moves across the circle in a straight line. So it's this combination of rotational and linear motion that we have to be aware of. So also the other thing that's important is momentum. So momentum is the quantity of motion of a body, and it's produced as a combination of weight and velocity. So when a body, a mass is moving, it carries with it a certain amount of momentum, and that momentum will keep going. It will cause it to move in different ways. So you have to be aware not only of the forces involved that you're creating, but also about the forces that your momentum is carrying through into your body and into the implement. So there's a transfer of momentum also from one body part to the next, and that's important for us to understand. So angular momentum is the quantity of rotational motion that a body has to do, and this is a combination of the moment of inertia and the rotational velocity. So one example of this is a very clever person that makes these very nice designs. I don't know if you can see this, but so by rotating around and then stopping quickly, you see that the momentum carries through into the discus. So this is a very nice little movement demonstration of a simple movement around, carried up through the body, and the momentum is transferred through the body. So one of the other things in momentum is that the length that your arms, or we've all seen a figure skater where they spinning on the ice with their arms out wide. It goes slower. When they move their arms in quicker, closer, then they turn faster. So you understand also that the momentum and the rotating body and the moment of inertia will cause also acceleration at time. If you go from a wide sweep to a narrow turn, so you can see the pathway of the discus here. She goes from a wide sweep with the legs and then a fast turn in the middle. So you get that long to fast to long trajectory. So it's a nice way of just watching what's happening, and also this transfer of the angular momentum from one body part to the next. So the legs are using their force, they're driving you across and then turning in the middle, and then the arms will deliver the discus. The force is put up through the body. But also what's important here is that the ability to stop the movement, to block this left-hand side in a right-handed thrower, the blocking the left side of the body delivers and transfers that angular momentum to accelerate the right side and put more force into the throw. So it's also important that we use and we understand the ability that stopping is also important. So stopping actually is just as important as driving the forces. That transfer of momentum, particularly in the lighter implements. So in a shot put, we are pushing from the middle of the circle, but in the discus and very much in the javelin, we are slinging from a long distance away. So we're applying forces and then passing that force up through the body in order to deliver a lighter implement that is more of a sling at the end. This is a 97-meter javelin throw, 96-meter javelin throw from this year. And you can see actually the ability to stop that movement. If you watch his left leg and what that is doing. So that's a rapid stop, boom, here. And that transfers all the energy up through the body so that the javelin can pass into the, can throw. He can flick the javelin off and the energy goes into the javelin, and he blocks just long enough to pass the energy through, and then he will transfer his body weight over that to stop injuring himself. Once he's let go of the javelin. So that's important to know that you can transfer. I say that's important, particularly in the throws, because one of the things that we found out, this is going back to the 1980s, some research from Klaus Bartenitz, the big difference, for example, with Ulf Timman, who's one of the best shot putters in the world, former world record holder, the difference between his 19-meter and his 22-meter throws were actually that his hit distance traveled on a good throw. his right hip only moved 45 centimeters, whereas on a less good throw, a 19-meter throw, it traveled 60 centimeters. So his ability to stop his momentum was not as good on the lesser throws. So what's important for him is that he would be very, very strong with the left leg. The ground reaction forces with the left leg would stop that momentum, and that would pass the energy into the shot. And if he wasn't able to stop his momentum, if he moved too much and his left side wasn't strong enough, then he lost a huge amount of distance just by not blocking strongly enough. So what does that mean for the coach? The most important thing is that two principles that apply when you're trying to optimize the force and the speed in an event. That is that you want to use all the joints that can be used. So I mean in the ground, in a shot put, in this example here, we are applying force to the ground. That pushes through the legs and then into the hips and then into the trunk and then into the shoulder, then to the elbow, and finally the wrist at the end. And if you time that well and you use every joint in order, so you're building up that movement pattern, then you sum forces, you add up all the forces, so the force at the end is the greatest it can be. And one of the important things to look for is that you do not want to have any energy leaks at any of these parts. So if you attack the ground and put great force in with your legs and your hips are really strong, but then you bend at the waist and your trunk is not strong enough, then all that energy is lost and you cannot then push it forwards into the arm and the wrist and into the implement in the shot put. So it's very important that we keep the energy in the system and we don't lose it along the way. So every joint in order. As a skill, when we learn the skill, we practice, we take energy from the ground and we pass it up through the body. This is David Stahl, pushing the ground away, driving the hips, and then the arms, and finally the hand. So you work with the big muscle groups and you move out through the progressively smaller muscles from big to small, from the ground to the hand, the tip of your fingers, and the force generated by one part of the body is built on top of the force of the previous part. So the timing is also very, very important. So just as the leg extension starts to decelerate and not apply any force, we then go to the hip and then add the next part on top, so that we are summing forces each time. So the release velocity is to the implement depends on the speed of the last part of the body at release. And that means that you're adding all the forces as you go through the different movements patterns. You'll see it takes first from the ground, foot, knee, hip, then the shoulder, and then the hand. So we're going from the ground to the fingertips, and we're going from the big muscles, using the big muscles of the legs and the quadriceps, up through the spine, up through the core and into the shoulders and the arms. And finally, you flick off the fingers, and that should give you all the energy you need if done well. So again, it's a principle called McCloy's principle, that any muscle group must try and work at the time of the maximum velocity and minimum acceleration by the previous muscle group. So if you build your pattern just on top and your timing is good, then it will fire very efficiently. And if you try to move too quickly from one thing, either early or late, that rhythm is out, then you will not get the forces and you will have much lower release velocity. What you're trying to do is put all the energy through, so it's like cracking a whip, and you have a very fast action at the finish. So hopefully this will give you an idea of clever guy here. I'm going from the ground up to the top. So, and that timing as well. So let's go to Newton's laws. Newton's laws of motion. We all learned this at school. What does it mean? It's very important, obviously, in biomechanics. So the first law, law of inertia, all bodies will continue in a state of rest or uniform motion in a straight line unless acted on by some other force. So once you put something in motion, it stays in motion unless another force acts on it. The law of acceleration is the acceleration of a body is proportional to the force causing it and takes place in the direction the force acts. So if you're pushing from behind, then you will move in that direction, and the amount of force that you apply on the mass that you contain will tell you the force is the mass times the acceleration, and that we know F equals ma. So the force is related to the mass and the speed that you're moving at and the change of place that you're moving at. And then the third one, which is very important, the law of conservation of momentum, that merely says for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So that means when we push against the ground, when we're trying to throw the shot, we attack the ground and the ground will push back at us with the same energy that we put into it. So that is the energy that we're using to pass through the body into the shot put. We're not just using our arm muscles, we're using our legs to attack the ground, and the ground will push back at us in the same amount of force that we put into it. That's very important so that we know we're applying forces in the right way to get the right result. So the more force means more acceleration. In the throwing events, the larger force exerted on an implement, because we are throwing something, the greater will be the acceleration and then consequently the distance thrown. We could be a long jumper, in which case we are applying force against the ground and it is the body of the jumper that is moving. But we as throwers, we are trying to move the implement, whether it's a shot put or a hammer or a javelin. And so the force is the most force we can put in is going to give us the greater distance. So once an implement has been released, there are no forces which can act to accelerate it. So once it's left our hand, we can't do anything to make it go faster. But gravity and air resistance are starting to decelerate it pretty much as soon as it leaves our hand. So that it will be pulled down to the ground. It will not stay in the air forever because there are forces acting on it. So therefore, Newton's first law applies. So the greater the force the athlete exerts at release, the greater the distance achieved. So supposedly, once the athlete has left the ground, there's nothing that he can do to accelerate the implement. But in fact, we're finding that's not quite the case in certain areas. So because Tom Walsh in the World Championships in 2017, if you follow this pathway along, this is the speed of the implement as he goes through his technique, starting at the back, driving all the way through. And then you will see at the top here, it says right leg take off. So this is the brace leg touchdown, left leg comes down at the front. He's pushing with the force from the right leg. And then the right leg comes off the ground. And then the left leg comes off the ground before he actually releases. So we have this story about you can't fire a cannon from a canoe because the cannon will come out and the canoe will move in the other direction. But in fact, if you're 140 kilos and the shot that you're throwing is 7 kilos, you have a 20-to-1 advantage. So actually, you can still push even though your feet are off the ground. And if your timing is good, you're going to add force to it. So he gains 2 meters per second once his feet have left the ground because he's still able to apply force with his arm against his body mass into the shot put. So that's something that's interesting. So the parabolic flight, because of the action of gravity, as I said, if it was an athlete and we were jumping into the air, our center of mass would also follow a parabolic curve. So we would go up. Oh, excuse me. Let's go back a second. we would go up in the air and gravity would pull us down. And so therefore, the force that we're applying in the horizontal direction will have also a force in the vertical direction that starts to pull us back down to ground with a 9.81 meters per second. So therefore, the most important factors in the distance or the horizontal displacement of a projectile, whether it's a person or in the case of the throws, there are three main factors. That's the angle of release, the speed of release, and the height of release. So of these, the most important for us is the speed at release. It's the most important factor. Greater speed means greater distance. Also, what's important is that the velocity of release is it's the only parameter that can be maximized by the athlete's action. So the pathway, as we apply force, the greater force that we can apply will have a greater distance a greater impact on the distance of the event. Now that you can actually find a way of figuring out the distance, the projected distance, based on a formula. I won't go through details of the formula, but this is the velocity squared, and then the sine of the angle of release, gravity underneath that. So gravity is acting on it. And then we have 2 times gravity and the height of release. And then again, velocity squared over the other side. So the most important thing for us there is that because velocity is squared, it means that velocity has the much bigger impact on the result than either the height of release or the angle of release. So the height of release is usually quite standard in a shot put. Maybe you release it at 1.90 meters or 2 meters. That's only going to make a very small difference, 10 centimeters to the overall distance. And even the angle of release has a limited impact compared to the speed. So in shot put and hammer, the wind resistance is negligible, but in javelin and discus, it has a big impact. So if we look at an example of that you can see that at the top of these 2 parabolas we're showing here, one is when you have a different speed of release. So one at 30 meters per second, 40 meters per second, and 50 meters per second. You can see the green line, which is 50 meters per second, the top line, results in much, much greater distance than the others. Now, if we compare that to just the angle of release, for example, one at an optimum angle, the middle one, the purple, is at 45 degrees, and that travels a good distance. And similarly, if you go a high angle of release or a low angle of release, both of those reduce the distance quite dramatically. So when we're talking about applying forces, one of the things that's important for us also is balance, and particularly in the hammer, but it applies to all the events. So this is a young 9-year-old girl from Hungary. I'm not sure if you can see this well, but she probably, I think the hammer is as tall as her, but she has good technique and she starts very young. So therefore she learns the balance and the principles of technique very early on, and then her technique becomes good. Then she can add strength to it. This is a British hammer throw. So one of the favorites for the Olympics next year. You can see how smooth he is in his technique. He's very strong, but the one thing he's been working on is to be very balanced with very little body movement. He stays in a very good position and travels across the circle, applying force in the direction of the throw. So each time his foot lands on the ground, he applies more force to the ground. And each time it touches, he just pushes the ground away. And each time then he accelerates now into the throw. So if we talk about the hammer, one of the important things is to try and keep the balance so that we're not moving all over the place. You saw then in Nick that he was very steady. And if we can keep the direction, the orbit of the hammer in a good point, the low point and in front of you and the high point behind you in the direction of throw, if we keep those in a clear, efficient pattern, then that makes for a very much more efficient throw. And the better throwers will try to do this. If you're very, very strong, you can get away with it, and maybe you have more movement around to try and help you get in position. But you can see the better technicians, this is Koji Murafushi, moves in a pretty much straight line across the circle. And he starts with a wide base because a wide base gives more stability. And then as he accelerates and goes across, he gets a little taller each time, gets a little faster, but also brings his base in a little narrower because he's moving very quickly, and keep adding forces in a good pattern. You can see Koji goes in a kind of a straight line and lands with his right foot always in a good position. Christian Paz, who's another very top thrower, has a little more movement with the feet at the end of double support at the bottom, but good positions going straight across the circle. Good hammer throwers will tend to deliver a straight line movement across. And the other thing in the hammer is that you have also the orbit of the hammer from high to low as you're driving across. So, and on the right here, this is Kentin Bigo, silver medalist in the World Championships. You should be able to see the tracking of the hammer in this throw. So you can see that each turn it gets a little steeper, gets a little deeper. So you start flat, and because it's easy to control the hammer when it's flat out in front of you. And then when you build up speed and momentum, the hammer is pulling against you with a great force. You have to balance that, and it's like a tug of war that you only want to tie. You're not trying to pull back too far. You're trying to keep in balance in the middle. So the hammer turns around you with a very nice long orbit. And each time you're just applying force in the direction to take you across the circle. And each time you get a little steeper so that you can get closer towards that 45-degree optimal. But it's very difficult in the hammer to hold on to the forces. We're talking about forces of 800 newtons, 800 kilograms, sorry, pulling against you, 350 kilograms, sorry, pulling against you in a hammer, which is very tough. And you can see here what we call this relative upswing angle. This is just the angle of the hammer as you start out. It gets steeper as you go through the first, second, third, into the fourth turn into delivery. So we're trying to move across the circle. So we have linear movement across the circle while rotating. So a very complicated pattern, doing usually 4 turns, but each turn is moving forwards and backwards. The translational forces are very important in the hammer. The difference between a 70-meter hammer thrower and an 80-meter hammer thrower are not usually strength. It's related to how much you put the force in and a good force, good timing into the ground. So that the balance as you move across, so that each time your feet land in double support, you apply force to accelerate back against that, so that you have smooth acceleration through the turns, and that is what will deliver you the distance at the end. No leaks, no energy loss. So one of the things that we have in the javelin and the discus particularly, they are not just a projectile, they also are aerodynamic. So we need to know a little bit about what happens in terms of the air. And so just generally, one of the things in a javelin, as the javelin goes through the air, it causes turbulence above the javelin, which creates lift, like an airplane wing. There are various rules around that, but basically when the air goes above the javelin, it creates a little bit of a vacuum of a pocket, and it causes the javelin to lift up. So the turbulence above it allows the javelin to stay in the air a little bit longer. You have a similar effect with the discus. So one thing we have to look into. So, and the other thing about the javelin is the center of pressure. And that means also kind of where the balance is, but also where the pressure of the wind acting on it as it goes through. Because the javelin will change also depending on the angle that it's flying at and the wind conditions. So you have to be very aware of that. It's a very complicated event to deal with the center of pressure, because that also will have an impact on when the javelin will start to tip down, and therefore it will shorten the distance. We try to make it fly flat as long as possible, but so therefore the center of pressure and the center of mass can be changed so that if you've got an 800-gram javelin that's intended for a 60-meter thrower, the tip will come down earlier than one that's aimed for a 90-meter javelin thrower. They will look for one that will fly a little longer and try not to tip out until the last minute so that they can get the full flight of the javelin. So one of the other things that happens in the discus is quite interesting is javelin, it rotates, that gives it some stability. And in the discus also, the discus will spin, and that creates some stability as it flies through the air. If it doesn't spin, it will tip very easily. That spinning movement, the faster you can make it spin, the greater the stability of the discus. It will fly flatter for longer because of the inertia as it spins around. So one of the things that can show you this, just an idea of a kind of a.
So I have some angular momentum.
Yes, angular momentum.
Now when I rotate it,
coming through, you can see that
start to spin. If I want to stop myself,
the energy will
stop. If I go the other way,
will impart force to the person.
I spin back around,
sitting on the chair. So the energy that's stored up, the angular momentum is stored up. As you move it, as you turn it, it will transfer and cause you to move around. That energy will have to go somewhere. So therefore, it creates its own torque vector and will perpendicular to the angle of rotation. So it will cause it to turn if you try and turn it out of that stable pattern that it's in. So one of the things is important for discus throwers to learn how to use this. And also in the discus, we have this lift, similar to the javelin. We have a lift and a drag effect. So as an aerofoil with the air that's coming through it, it's not aerodynamic like an aeroplane wing, but it can be angled in the wind in order to get the best effects from the wind conditions. And you have to learn how to use that wind in the best way. So there is an angle of delivery, but there's also an angle of attack relative to the wind that's coming in. So you can have the tip up or down of the javelin or the discus, and this will have an impact on how the discus or the javelin will fly. So if the discus is tilted slightly into the airflow will help it to stay in a flatter plane for longer before it starts dropping down out of the sky. So the angle of attack is the angle between the discus plane and the airflow, and the optimum ratio of lift to drag has been measured in a wind tunnel, and it's about 10 degrees. So you want a slight angle of attack, a slight lift up of the tip of the discus in order to allow you to fly. If your discus is too flat, it will drive down too early, but also if it's too steep, the wind will hit it and slow it down. So you need to have a low angle of attack so that the discus will continue to try and rise up and continue to fly as long as possible. So the angle of attack, you can see how it impacts on the flight. So the angle of attack, the discus with a negative angle, the dark line here, travels the greatest distance because it maximizes the lift, and therefore it uses the wind to best effect. Usually you try to throw into a wind, although the world record was thrown with a tailwind, and then you would change the angle of attack so that it would blow the discus along a little more. so that you would try and get benefits from it. So one of the things you have to learn. The other point about angular momentum, which is important for us, particularly when it comes to things like the discus, is that the longer you can make the arm that you are swinging, the more speed that you will have. So if you can lengthen, sorry, I'm going to go back a bit. So if we're using a baseball bat here as an example, at point A, only halfway along the bat, it is traveling around in a circle much slower at that point than the end of the bat that's further away, because the angle that it's turning through is turning at the same rate, but because the distance is much further away, you're traveling much further at the far end. So therefore, you can try and lengthen the arm in a number of ways to improve the discus. If you get a longer radius on the discus, can have a major impact on the distance thrown, because the speed will be greater at the point of delivery. So when we're rotating and arm is swinging, the discus speed has the discus is going much faster at the end of a long arm than a short arm. So you can see here the arm length is very, very important to make it to have a big impact on the discus. The taller the athlete and the longer the arms, a big advantage they have. Daniel Stahl at 2 meters and 2 has an arm span of 2 meters and 15. So you can see here, and he's also trying to lengthen that arm as much as possible to come away from his body as much as possible without losing any energy, so that he can make have the largest impact. And that's what he's working on at the moment in his technique. He's working hard to try and maximize the radius that he can get, and by keeping that arm out wide without losing any energy. So just as an example, we just did an assumption with an arm length of 0.6 meters, comparing it to someone with an arm length of 0.85 meters. So the smallest value we're talking about would be 10.8 meters per second for the short arm, and the largest value would be 15.6 meters per second. But you can see with an arm length just 25 centimeters longer, then you get something like 40% larger velocity at release by lengthening the arm. So anything you can do, 2 centimeters is worth maybe a meter in the discus. So anything you can do to lengthen the arm without losing force is important. This is Daniel Stahl last week, and he's using a discus tool, a Denfi tool, which is like a small hammer, but you can get an idea of the power he's getting here. Yeah. So he's trying to get as long as possible, make long movement, with really big delivery at the end. So same thing, you can see a little better. See how he's just kind of leaning out a little bit into the throw to try and lengthen that right arm. So, and then you can see the speed and the power he's got in the end. This is a 3.5 kilo Denfi. He's moving it very, very quickly. So one of the things I just put this in because one of the things going back in history, the various machines of war back in the 14th, 15th century, they had a couple that were important. One was a catapult on the left, where the catapult was basically had an arm that was throwing, and it was thrown under tension. So you would tie up the arm. It was against ropes. So you'd build up rotational tension, and then you let it go, and it would flick sorry, let's go back again. It would flick the ball, the payload, over the top of the arm here, the cantilever type spring. So, but then they found that by creating a longer arm with a sling on it even more, they could double the weight of the of the payload, so they could send even bigger rocks. And so the trebuchet with this sling on the end of it had a much bigger advantage. And that's one of the things we try to do within the discus and the javelin particularly. We try to get a sling effect by getting that extra length and getting that extra flick at the end to make a difference. With the javelin, we also have to be aware of the angle of attack. Neutral would be a clean angle at the same angle of release, but you can have a positive angle of attack or a negative angle of attack. Negative when it goes tall, when it goes high. Then each can have a different impact. A negative angle attack exposes more of the javelin to the airflow, so it slows it down. It creates a greater wind resistance. And a positive angle attack going a little lower could go better into the wind. So we're always trying to experiment in the different wind conditions to try and see what we have to do. And the most important thing, though, is to try and have a clean throw through the air, and so little movement in the javelin as possible. There is also in the javelin, you have another thing called the angle of yaw, because it's a long stick, it's 2.5 meters long. Not only can it go up and down, it can also go left to right. So this also exposes more of the javelin to the wind and can slow down the javelin and create a big resistance to it as it flies. So you also have to be aware of this angle of yaw, the difference between the straight throw and where the javelin is as you release it. You'll see very often, you'll see the javelin flex as it leaves somebody's hand because they haven't quite hit it cleanly through the point, and they're moving maybe their shoulder away to create space for it. So the angle of yaw is also important. So the air resistance that basically is what's meeting the wind, or as the javelin goes through the air, the greater the area exposed to this wind, the more negative the effect. So air resistance increases by the square of the increase in speed, because how you're going through it, it's hitting more air, it's slowing down greater. So, oh, sorry, back again. Going the wrong way here. And one of the things is that the javelin itself creates some wind resistance. I don't know if you can see this. It's very hard to see this. This is actually a special imaging. It comes from a radar, Doppler radar. But if you watch, if I play this again, and you watch the javelin as it comes out, you'll see it's not quite straight. It's got a slight angle of attack. And you can see the pattern of the wind resistance, the air above and below it. So that's not a clean path. It creates a lot of noise and wind resistance on this delivery. It shows you how much drag is already, having just left the thrower's arm, the drag is also causing a big problem. So if you can increase the speed of release by 5%, you get a 10% longer throwing distance. So speed is always key. This is in the javelin particularly. An improved angle of release by 5% means less than 2% distance throwing. So it's nowhere near as important. Improved height of release results in approximately the same improvement in the throwing distance. So if you are releasing 10 centimeters higher, you're getting 10 centimeters more distance. So the speed is the important thing, but also the air resistance is increased squared by the increase of the speed. So therefore it means that the speed is a plus, but any resistance that you get because the javelin is not flying straight or exposed to as little as possible to the wind will negate that advantage you get from the speed. So therefore, what we have to look for is to try and maximize the speed of release, but also to hit cleanly through the point of the javelin. So when the speed of release, it's at delivery. So one of the things that's really important in the javelin is that you are transferring all the energy that's coming from the run-up, from the 80 kilogram mass of the person that's throwing, and then he goes into a big block. So all that energy, you're going in, the top guys are running in 27 kilometers an hour. And the speed of the javelin that's coming in with that person coming in at 9 meters a second or so, 27 kilometers an hour. Then very quickly, within 0.13 of a second, it goes up to 110 kilometers an hour at the release speed for a 90-meter thrower. So you can see that huge increases on delivery. So key numbers here, as an example, this is, so you've got an 800-gram javelin that's coming in at 7 meters per second on the runway. You're going to release it at an angle of about 34.8 degrees here. So that's going to give you a release speed at 30.1 meters a second to go 90 meters, right? But what that's going to require is a blocking force of 1,000 kilograms coming through your left foot. And all that happens from your left foot landing to the release of the javelin in 0.13 of a second. So this is why javelin throwers also get very injured in the hips. And it's also why you see many of them, once they've already imparted the force to the javelin, will come off that block and maybe go through the air themselves because the forces involved are so high. In the World Championships last year, one athlete dislocated his shoulder at the delivery on his 5th attempt. And even though he had no muscles and nothing connecting the shoulder because it was dislocated, the force and the energy that he put into the block and the transfer of that energy, the javelin still went 78 meters on that throw with no finish to it. So the 5 points, this is basically on the javelin, but they're applicable to everyone, all the events, but particularly to javelin. Optimal speed of approach. So optimal speed across the circle, because if you go too fast, you can't handle it. So body posture, the positioning, you need to be strong in your body to resist the loading that we're asking it to. The rhythm, that nice rhythm in all throws is there. And a delayed strike, delayed arm in the javelin, so that the forces have time to add up and transfer all that energy through the system. And then, of course, this firm block with the left side, you need it in all the events. You need all the energy to go into a firm block so that all of the energy is transferred through the system and into the implement at the finish. So that was my rushed version. I tried to get through it as quickly as I could. So I hope that was understandable for some of you, and happy to answer any questions that you might have. It's a lot of information in a short time, so apologies, but I'll send you the slides if you so you can go through them in your own time.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very nice, and you touched the most important questions to be aware when looking for the biomechanics of throws. We will look if there are some questions, and we will put it to you. Let's see if.
I was just trying to give an overview. It's not detailed. I'm not a biomechanist. Paulo Oliveira is much better than me. So, but I just tried to give you an overview of some of the key things that as a coach, you should be aware of. That's the most important thing.
We understand that. We know that you are not biomechanist, and okay, you have a good experience, and you translate this biomechanics to the field. So you translate it to us, and it is nice. I think that there is no question.
I think it will take time for them to digest it all. I don't expect too many questions.
Yeah. Looking for your presentation, I think it seems that the aerodynamics is did not play the same role in all the throws. And there is some strategy concerning this problem of wind and so on during trying to improve the ability of the athlete to go further.
Yeah. In the shot put and hammer, the effects of the wind are negligible. In the hammer, there is some because it travels so far. And more importantly, the wind affects the thrower rather than the implement, because hammer throwers don't like being pushed forwards. If the wind is behind them, it pushes them forward onto their toes as they're trying to turn across the circle. So it has a bigger impact on the technique than actually the flight characteristics, the parabola. It's not so important there. But in the javelin and the discus, it's a massive, massive part. And if you can learn to throw and learn what to do, and it's very difficult, it's very hard to have that control. It's one of the reasons I think Thomas Roller is probably the best javelin thrower in terms of hitting clean through the point, because he's not very big, he's not very strong. Whereas you compare him to Hoffman or Vetter, they're massively strong. Yeah, and so they can overpower him and get away with a lot more, whereas he will try and find his point and find his place. So in difficult conditions, he is very good because he can utilize the javelin. He has very, very good control on the javelin, and he works very hard on that. The discus is very hard to do. I'm actually working with Daniel Stahl on that at the moment, because he wants to break the world record this next year. Okay. And we're pretty sure that he has the power and the strength. You could see him throwing. It's ridiculous how far he can throw. But he's never really worried too much about the flight of the discus, because he always just had so much power. He has just horsepower. He's just a massively strong guy, and he's a big guy. And that's his big advantage, right? He's 160 kilos. So the other guys that he's competing against are maybe 135 kilos. So he's just bigger than them, but he still moves really, really fast. And he's 2 meters and 2, and he's 215 centimeters arm span. So he has all the tools to break the world record. And, certainly he has massive power to do it. Now we're just trying to get him to understand a little bit more about the flight characteristics. He doesn't even care what discus he throws. Okay. So he just throws, his favorite discus is an old one that they no longer make anymore. So he doesn't look to try and find a nice discus with high rim weight and stuff. He'll throw anything. It doesn't matter. And he can throw any discus 70 meters any day. So it's he's not a finesse thrower.
Okay. Okay. It seems that there is no question for the participants on this seminar. So I would like to Okay. No, Paulo Oliveira is there. He's saying that it's always amazing to listen to you talk about biomechanics applies in throwing. Thank you for your consideration.
Paulo's doing a great job. I have a very high regard for him and what he's doing, because he also is trying to make things simple and available for people. So I speak with him a lot, and also Paulo Reis, to make sure that the information they're getting, so that, and you can see the advantage, you can see the benefits that they're having with Oriol Dongmo. She's doing a good job. Mm-hmm. And so having someone like Paulo to feed back information is very valuable. So you're lucky to have him.
Okay. Therefore, thank you very much, Shaun. And we will move on, because there is no more question for anybody.
I'll send you my presentation. I'll send you the PDF so that you can distribute it to people if you want.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
We appreciate that.
All right. Good luck, everyone. Thank you.
Thank Bye.